How is this lens any different from this one or that one? We're going to talk all about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey everybody, welcome back. As always, here I am answering your photography questions. Don't forget to go to AskDavidBergman.com. Ask your own questions there and I will pick the best ones to answer right here on a future show. Today's question is from Jorge A. and he asked, lenses look complicated and can be intimidating. They're all different sizes and some have various modes and functions. How do I pick the right lens? Jorge, thanks so much for asking that question. You know, here on Ask David Bergman, sometimes we do some more advanced photography stuff, and so I really want to bring it down and talk about lenses today. Maybe you're buying your first DSLR, you're stepping up from a cell phone, and you're looking at all these lenses, and you don't really understand why you'd choose one over the other and why they're such different price ranges. So what we're going to do is think of this as Lenses 101. First of all, let's talk about very basically what a lens is. Really all it is it's a tube with some glass in it that focuses the light onto the sensor in the back of your camera, right? So those pieces of glass, we call them lens elements. They're precision made, right? Those are precision lens elements that are made just perfectly to focus that light so it hits the back of that camera and exposes the sensor, making your picture. Now, there are also some aperture blades inside these lenses. You know, those blades that open and close down that you've seen? So those are also inside of a lens. When it's open, it exposes the sensor. It exposes the shutter curtain, which opens, exposing the sensor. And when they're closed, no light goes through there. And they can open and close to different sizes. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Now, when you're thinking about what lens to buy or what lens to use, the first thing you're looking at is what we call focal length. It's measured in millimeters. And basically, you can go from wide angle all the way to super telephoto, right? So a wide angle lens generally referred to as 35 millimeter or smaller. That smaller number, the smaller the numbers get, 28 millimeters, 20 millimeters, 24 millimeters, 20, 18, they keep going lower and lower. As those numbers get lower, your field of view is going to get wider and wider. So you're going to see more from the place you're standing. You're going to see more of the scene in front of you. Now, wide-angle lenses generally are good for things like landscapes, where you really want to have just this sweeping tableau picture where everything is kind of in focus, and you just want to get a good look at the entire scene, and there could be lots of things going on in there. That's really what you would use a wide-angle lens for. Then in the middle range, we have what we call a standard lens, which is somewhere from like 35 millimeters to 85 millimeters. And that's roughly what our eyes see, right? That field of view in our eyes. It's not super crazy wide, but not really zoomed in. It's just kind of it's a general purpose lens that you would use maybe for everyday street photography or that kind of thing. And then at the far end of the spectrum are these big telephoto lenses. Those are 85 millimeters or more, right? And they go all the way up to 600, 1200, right? I've seen 1200 millimeter lenses. They don't really make too many of those, but they are out there. But a 600 millimeter lens might be something a sports photographer would use, or 400 millimeter lens, maybe for wildlife. Those things where you really need to zoom in really tight and you just physically can't get any closer to something, and you want to get in, you know, again with wildlife, you can't be right up next to the birds in the tree, right? So you might use that focal length to get in. Or sports. I shot sports for many years. I used to use those massive 600 millimeter lenses on the sidelines, right? Those running up and down the sidelines with that lens over my shoulders. And that was really good because if you're 30, 40, 50 yards away from the action on the sidelines, you can get in close and get those great photographs. So that's really what we're talking about with focal length. And of course, every lens is different as far as that goes. Then there are two general types of lenses past focal lengths, right? So one is called a prime lens, and really what that means is the focal length is fixed. It's not a zoom lens, it just stays in one place. So like this, for example, this is an 85 millimeter lens. It's only an 85 millimeter lens, that's it. If you want to zoom in tighter, you have to zoom with your feet. You have to walk in closer or you have to back up. That's the only way you're going to be able to zoom in or out. Now, that of course can be a negative if you really prefer having that zoom range, but prime lenses are actually really awesome because they are lighter than their zoom equivalents. They're generally faster, which means they have a wider aperture. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And they're also usually less expensive than the corresponding zoom lens. But again, you can't zoom with them. So you have to kind of choose which of those things is more important to you. And then zoom lenses, like this is a 24 to 105. This lens now allows me to zoom all the way from 24 millimeters wide angle up to 105 millimeters, which is pretty nice tight zoom. So That gives me a lot more flexibility than a prime lens, but they are more expensive and they're heavier than their prime counterparts. So like I said, whichever of those is more important to you is the way you're generally going to want to go. Other things to consider with lenses. Most lenses today are autofocus, which means they have electronic mechanisms inside there so the camera can control the focus. When you take a picture of somebody, it generally is going to focus on them, usually it's whatever's closest to you. There are a lot of different focus settings. I've done videos on that you can look up. But if you wanted a manual focus lens, then you would have to actually turn the focus ring to change your focus manually. They still sell those. Not a lot of people use them. They're fun to play around with if you want to do that. They're very inexpensive because they don't have those electronic mechanisms built in there. But generally they're older lenses and they can be found. So if you want to play around with that, but most lenses today are going to have that autofocus built into them. The other main thing with lens is what we talk about with maximum aperture. So like I said, the aperture are those blades inside and they open and close. And the wider you can open those blades, the more light you're going to let into that lens, right? The bigger the opening, the more light's going to come through. And if you have more light hitting your sensor, that gives you a lot of other options photographically. You can shoot with a faster shutter speed, you can shoot with a lower ISO. There's a lot of advantages to having more light come in. So the wider the aperture, the better that's going to be. A wider aperture affects a thing called bokeh, which is that out of focus background. If you shoot really wide open, your background is going to go more out of focus from your subject. So, and the quality of that, the more out of focus it is, the more pleasing it is in most cases. When you want that subject to really pop off the background from that creamy, smooth, out of focus background, you need to shoot at a very wide aperture. So, that's going to make a difference on what lens you want because some lenses can go to really wide apertures and some cannot. Generally, the lesser expensive lenses are going to have smaller maximum apertures. So that's going to be a limitation that you're going to want to consider when you're buying lenses. A few more other little things just to keep in mind when you're buying lenses. Most lenses now have image stabilization, which is there's a gimbal actually inside the lens that will help stabilize that lens because just when you're hand holding that camera, especially if you're shooting at a slow shutter speed, it sometimes is hard to hold it still for long enough. So that gimbal will help stabilize your image and it'll be sharper. It's really more important for video shooters because they really want that rock solid image. Usually they're going to shoot on a tripod, but if you're hand holding, you really want image stabilization in video. Again, something to consider. There are also some specialty lenses you can buy, things like fisheye lenses. That gives like a distorted, really wide field of view, sometimes up to 180 degrees of your entire scene, and it gets all weird at the edges. It starts to warp a little bit, but it's kind of a cool effect. I wouldn't do that with every image, but once in a while, it's kind of fun. There are lenses like tilt shift lenses that really screw with the field of view, the focus, and it gets all kind of funky. That a lot of architecture photographers use that to help normalize when you're shooting up at a tough angle. And then there are things like macro lenses, which allow you to do close-up photography. Some of them have a minimum focusing distance of like an inch or less, and you can really get in there and photograph things that are very small, insects or flowers and things like that. Some of the other lenses, Jorge, you asked about controls and things. Some of the bigger zoom lenses have things like focus preset buttons. And then also when you read about lenses, some of the more expensive lenses have coatings on them, extra coatings to prevent image weirdness, things like chromatic aberration. It's going to degrade the quality of your image. So that's really at the high end. The pro lenses are all going to have things like that to really make sure you're shooting the highest quality image possible. Now, when you're buying a lens, there's really, just a handful of things you want to consider, taking all that into account. Of course, you need to make sure you buy the right lens for your camera. Each camera brand has its own mount, and you need to make sure, and even some brands have multiple mounts depending on which camera you're using. So you need to make sure you get the correct lens for your camera. If you already have a camera, if you're buying a new system, of course, just make sure they match. But then there's that aperture issue, right? And the widest the aperture can go really makes a huge difference in cost. So for example, this lens is a 50 millimeter lens. This happens to be a 1.4 widest aperture. You can buy a 1.8. I don't own one, but you can buy a 1.8 that's even smaller than this. That's $125, right? This 1.4 50 millimeter lens, same focal length, is about $325, $350. And then this, also a 50 millimeter, same exact focal length, but it's a 1.2. It's one of the new Canon RF lenses for the brand new mirrorless. This 1.2 50 millimeter lens is about $2,300. So makes a huge difference. Even though they're all the same focal length, the cost can vary wildly. So if you need to shoot at 1.2 and you want that glass, you're going to be paying for it. Having said that, I would invest my money in glass, in lenses, before I invest in cameras. Of course, you need to buy a good camera. If I had to choose, though, I would put my money in the lenses, because cameras are like computers. I mean, they are computers, and they're going to need to be replaced over time. Depending on how much you shoot and how important, if it's your career or a hobby, you might replace your cameras every 3, 4, 5, 6 years or so. But lenses, if you buy good lenses, they could last you a lifetime. So it's really important to buy good glass. Don't skimp out on glass, because you really could have, if a good investment will last you a very long time. The only other thing really to consider is, honestly, the size and the weight, right? So if you were on vacation, you're not going to want to carry this monster around with you, probably, right? On the beach. So generally, the old expression, Chase Jarvis used to say, the best camera is the one you have with you. If you're not going to carry this thing around and you only need something for vacation, don't buy it, right? Get a small lens and a small body that's going to be something you can bring with you and put with you. Now, if you're shooting sports, of course, you need the big glass. So make sure you get the right lens for your situation. Now, again, having said all that, just because I've said how lenses are supposed to be used, doesn't mean anything. Go get creative, right? Use lenses in ways you might not expect, right? Maybe take this super telephoto out and make a portrait with it, or use a fisheye lens at a concert. You're really only limited by your imagination. So go out. Photography is fun. It's creative. That's what separates every photographer from the others. So go out and have a good time, and let me see what kind of pictures you're making, maybe some unusual lens pairings, and show me what you're doing. Thanks, Jorge. I really appreciate that comment. Remember, AskDavidBergman.com. Don't forget, there's a form there, and make sure you ask your own photo questions so I can answer them on a future show. And then, of course, our friends at Adorama. Of course, it's where I buy all my gear. You're here on Adorama TV. We really appreciate that, but there is so much free photo content from myself and a lot of other hosts you could watch for days and days. You could stream that stuff and never get bored. So really appreciate you being here. Ask David Bergman premieres the new one every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern. I'll see you back here next week on Ask David Bergman.